Hey everyone. So today we've got a short lecture on the adult versus juvenile justice system as well as the rights of juveniles. But before we dive into that, I wanted to quickly talk about the test on Thursday. So we're having a test that's over the judicial branch as well as the adult and juvenile justice system, which we've already started kind of talking about. You're only going to have Thursday or Friday to get the test done. If you don't get it done during that time, we're going to have some issues to work out. It's critical that you take the test in SchoolNet because ultimately that's where your final exam is going to be. Now, there will be more information sent out in an email to your parents tomorrow about both Thursday's test and the final exam. But that being said, I just wanted to quickly also remind you guys as students that on the day of the test, you're going to need to log into Google Classroom to access or to get the test code. All right. All right, that about covers the testing stuff. Let's dive into the lecture. Okay, like I said, today it's on the adult versus juvenile justice system and the rights of juveniles. So really, you need to be able to compare and contrast the two different justice systems, and also understand like what are some of the special rights that juveniles have, but also like why do they have them? Okay. As a baseline, we're going to start with the adult criminal justice system. Now, there are 5 basic steps in that system: arrest, bail hearing, trial, sentencing, and appeal. And you need to know like the order that they are in and what each one of those words mean. So let's get started on that. Arrest. Arrest is basically your first encounter with the police. It's when they put handcuffs on you and they take you into jail, essentially. All right. Now, just because you've been arrested, it doesn't mean you're guilty of a crime, okay? That's not going to happen until we get to the trial. But sometimes it can take a while for a trial to happen. It's not like you get arrested and then instantly are put on trial. Like, that's not how that works, okay? There's often quite a lot of time between the arrest and when you actually go on trial, okay? So, to determine whether you need to stay in jail until your trial or if it's okay to release you until your trial, that is done in the adult criminal justice system at what is called a bail hearing. Now, depending on the severity of the crime, and what's going on in the circumstances, the judge could either say, "Hey, just make sure you come back for your trial," or the judge could say, "You need to stay in jail all the way up until your trial." But most often, what happens is a middle ground, where the judge requires you to pay a certain amount of money to the courts, and once your family does, essentially, you'll be released. All right, and the courts will hold on to that money until the trial. And if you show up for the trial, they'll give you that money back. All right, whether you're found guilty or innocent. Okay, but if you don't show up on time for the trial and do what the court tells you to do, then you'll forfeit that money. All right, and it'll become the property of the courts. Okay. So that's what the bail hearing does. Basically, it determines whether or not you are released or detained until your trial. All right, trial. It should be obvious what this is. This is where you are, where the court figures out whether or not you are guilty or innocent. Okay. Now over here on the side of our little chart, I've got something called the trial process. There are a bunch of different steps in the trial process, but these are 5 of the major ones. So jury selection. So again, you have a right to a trial by a jury of your peers. So some of the people who live in your community. And then there's opening arguments, opening statements. Evidence on both sides is presented for both the prosecution and the defense. Then they'll make a closing argument, and then the jury is going to go off to a room by itself, and they're going to figure out whether or not you're guilty. Once they figure that out, they'll let the judge know and announce the ruling. Now, you don't actually need to memorize all of this part, the trial process, for the test. I just wanted you to know that this is there, and this is oftentimes the part of it that you see in Law and Order and other television shows that depict court cases. Okay. So let's say you are found guilty. Then the next phase is called sentencing. That's right here. During sentencing, they determine exactly what your punishment is going to be for that particular crime. Okay. I think in Georgia that is done by the judge, but in some other states, the jury might be involved, or a different jury might be involved in the sentencing process. So let's say you're found guilty, you're sentenced to prison, and you feel like something didn't go right. We've already talked a lot about this, then you have the right to file an appeal. And that's ultimately the last step, though it is ultimately optional. And in that appeal, basically, you would file it with an appellate court, the Georgia Court of Appeals or the Georgia Supreme Court. If they want to listen to you, will look at your case and make a determination as to whether or not things were done the way they're supposed to be done, essentially. All right, so let's see how that compares with the juvenile justice system. There's some similarities, but there are some differences as well, some fairly big ones. Now, over here on the right side, I've got the steps we were just talking about, the basic steps in the adult criminal justice system, and that's going to help us walk ourselves through the juvenile justice system steps, because those steps are a lot less clear for reasons that we will come to talk about. All right. Now, instead of saying that a juvenile is arrested like an adult would be, instead we have what is called an intake officer determination. Now, intake officer is a special job in the juvenile justice system. This is a specially trained police officer who makes the decision as to whether or not to take a juvenile to jail or to some type of custody, or to just release them to their parents based on the circumstances and the nature of the determination, or the nature of the crime that the juvenile is accused of committing. Now, let's say the intake officer decides, like, yeah, the crime is pretty serious, we should probably go ahead and detain this person. Then at that point, a judge is going to make a release or detained determination. So this is kind of the equivalent of the bail hearing in the juvenile justice and the adult justice system. The reason we don't call it a bail hearing in juvenile justice is because kids don't have money, right? And ultimately, a bail hearing oftentimes involves sometimes very large amounts of money, okay? So this is where a judge kind of re-looks at the circumstances that the intake officer looks at and makes a secondary determination whether or not to hang on to this kid until trial, which we'll talk about in a second, or to go ahead and release them to the control of their parents or guardians, okay? Next up in the process, let's say they're released and they're waiting trial. So again, trial is what would come after a bail hearing in the adult justice system. Instead of calling it a trial, though, in the juvenile justice system, we call it an adjudicatory hearing. Now, that's a lot of fun to say, but basically it's like a trial. It's where guilt or innocence is determined. Now, here is one very large difference between the adult system and the juvenile system. In the adult system, if you recall, guilt or innocence is determined by a jury of your peers, people in your community. But in the juvenile justice system, that determination of guilt or innocence is made by the judge and the judge alone. This is largely because we want to try to protect the privacy of a juvenile, right? We don't want something stupid that you did when you were like 12, 13, 14 years old to follow you around for the rest of your life. And if you start bringing in a bunch of the people from your community, people are going to do what people normally do, and they're going to talk about the case. They're going to talk about who was involved, and word about what you did as a child is going to quickly spread throughout whatever your community is. And so largely we keep out juries from the juvenile justice system in order to protect the privacy, but also because there's special circumstances when it comes to kids, and you've got to kind of have a specialty. And the judges in juvenile courts, they are specially trained to handle those juvenile cases. Now, let's say you have your adjudicatory hearing and the judge determines that, like, yeah, Timmy, you did it. In that case, the next phase is going to be called sentencing. And that is where the judge determines what your punishment is going to be. From steps 4 and 5 are identical to the adult criminal justice system, okay? So once you're found guilty in the adult system by a trial, or in the juvenile system by an adjudicatory hearing, the next step after that is sentencing in both systems, okay? And that's where we determine what the punishment is going to be. Following on to that is the appeal, okay? So juveniles, just like adults, they have a right to appeal the ruling, all right? So you need to know both sets of steps, but all 5 of these for each system, and you need to be able to compare and contrast the two. Now, as juveniles are working their way through this process, they have some special rights that adults don't have, and then they have some rights that, or they don't have some rights that adults do have, and we're going to talk about both. Let's start with rights that juveniles have that adults do not have. So first of all, juveniles, when detained or questioned by the authorities, have the right to contact their parents, their family, their guardians, okay? That would be kind of weird for an adult. You know, you arrest some dude who's in his 40s and he's like, hey, let me call my mom. Like, that's odd, okay? And so obviously the answer there is no. But for juveniles, that makes a lot of sense. And so we do say it's a right for kids to be able to contact their parents or guardians. In the adult criminal justice system, trials are public. Like, in some cases, we even have like television cameras in there broadcasting everything live. That will not happen in a juvenile courtroom, okay? And again, this gets back to protecting that juvenile's right to privacy. So when arrested, a juvenile has a right not just to 1 phone call, but 2. 1 for the attorney. I don't know why a kid would know their attorney's number, but you know, whatever. And then also a right to call their parents again, okay? And you know how when adults are arrested, they get read their rights and they're told, you know, you have the right to remain silent, you don't have blah, 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 blah. And that is to try to inform an adult that, like, you don't want to self-incriminate. You don't have to say anything to the police that might incriminate you. Now, that concept is complicated and difficult for some kids to understand. And so kids have a right to be told and explained exactly what their rights are, but also what they mean, okay, and how to use them. And then finally, especially if you're like, finally, you have a right not to be placed with adult offenders, okay? Now, the things rights that juveniles lack that adults have, this again, it goes back to the need to maintain a juvenile's privacy, okay? So again, you're not going to have a public trial. There's not going to be television cameras in your like courtroom and stuff like that. And you're not going to have a jury in there. It's just going to be the judge and the attorneys. Okay. For today's assignment, you're basically going to be doing a sorting activity. So if we look here, first step is suspect is taken into custody. And we have an item bank up here, and you need to drag and drop them to the appropriate place, okay? So let's do this first one together. The suspect is taken into custody. In the adult criminal justice system, we call that arrest, all right? And in the juvenile criminal justice system, we call that intake officer determination. So let's go see if we can find that. All right, here's the adult criminal justice system side. So here's arrest, and we're just going to drag it over and drop it there. And that's all you got to do. Juvenile justice system. On the juvenile justice side, it is called, intake. All right, that's where the intake officer makes a determination whether or not to let you go to your parents or not. All right, determination of hold or release. So that is where in the adult criminal justice system, we call that, let's go back and look. We call that the bail hearing, okay? So in the bail hearing, we determine whether or not to let an adult go until their trial or to hold on to them. In the juvenile criminal justice system, what do we call that? Let's see here. Release or detained, okay? There's really not a better name for it, all right? So let's go see if we can find the release or detained. Yep, there you go. All right, go ahead and finish out the last 3 here. If you have any questions, you can post them in Google Classroom. You can shoot me an email. Any of those things will work. All right, guys. Hope everybody's staying healthy. Bye.